Some of the most troubling issues with utilitarianism concern justice. There seems to be an inherent conflict between the demand to maximize utility on the one hand and the requirements of justice on the other. Mill doesn't consider these in detail, since his purpose in this work is to promote utilitarianism, not to write a brief for its opponents. But the issues have been well known within ethical theory and widely discussed for years, if not centuries. I wanted to briefly highlight two areas of problems as a way to set up Mill's discussion of justice in Chapter 5 of Utilitarianism. And these are the areas of the moral asymmetry of harms and benefits, as we might call it, and of distributive justice. Both of these concern objections to act utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism instructs us to choose the act which, in a given situation, will produce the best outcome, where the best outcome is calculated solely in terms of the greatest net utility overall. So if you have, in a certain situation, 5 possible courses of action you could take, you should think in advance about what each one is going to do in terms of producing pleasure and pain, balance out the pleasures it will produce against the pains it will produce, and on the basis of that analysis, figure out which thing to do. The thing that will maximize the greatest net pleasure overall. The problem is, we can imagine situations in which choosing the action that will provide the greatest net utility overall seems to be self-evidently unethical. So this first area, which I call the moral asymmetry of harms and benefits, this has to do with the fact that our moral intuitions tell us that more than net utility matters. It also matters whether the act will be causing a particular individual an unjust harm. So take two examples that have been discussed in the literature. One is an organ transplant case. So you imagine that 5 people come into the hospital one day, and these people, in all respects, except for their health condition, which I will discuss in a second, will anticipate having an equivalent amount of pleasure in the future course of their lives, and also causing others an equivalent amount of pleasure. So, for example, let's say that they are all married, they are all roughly the same age, they all have the same number of children and friends. They all do work that has an equivalent social benefit. It's not that one of them is on the verge of curing cancer or something like that. Let's say they're all elementary school teachers or something like that. They all do work that has social benefit, but no one has a great deal more benefit than any other, and so forth. So 5 people come into the hospital, and one of these persons is a healthy person, but the other 4 are in desperate need of a vital organ transplant. So let's say one of them needs a heart, one of them needs a liver, and the 2 others need kidneys. So you have 5 people, you have the healthy person, and then the person who is going to die soon if they don't get a heart, the person who's going to die soon if they don't get a liver, a person who's going to die soon if they don't get a kidney, and another person who's going to die soon if they don't get a kidney. So you can probably already see where this is going. If you're a doctor in the hospital and you're being charged by the utilitarian to perform that action that will maximize utility, it seems that the thing that you should do is anesthetize the healthy person, put them to sleep, harvest their organs, and give the person's heart to the one person who needs a heart, the person's liver to the person who needs a liver, and take each of their kidneys and divide them between the other 2 people. Because in that way, of course, you can save 5 people rather than just 1. And those 5 people will go on, as according to the thought experiment, to produce, those 4 people will go on to produce 4 times as much utility as if you had just allowed the one healthy person to walk out of the hospital. But of course, this would be considered by every decent person to be a monstrous thing to do. You can't just harvest the organs of a healthy person for the sake of maximizing utility, even though it seems quite clearly that in this case, that is the thing to do if you want to maximize utility. So that's one example of this moral asymmetry of harms and benefits. It seems like our moral intuitions tell us that harming one person in this egregious fashion is worse than benefiting than the benefits that one would get from doing so. Second example, we can call this the generous thief case. So take 2 men, call them Smith and Jones. And let's say Smith and Jones are perfectly equal in their financial assets and obligations. Suppose both Smith and Jones derive exactly the same amount of pleasure from each dollar they own. So we're simplifying it. Obviously, this is a crude oversimplification, but for the sake of this thought experiment, let's just suppose that all of the utility that Smith and Jones get out of life is exactly proportional to the amount of money they have, and it's an equal amount for each dollar they own. So they get, 1 unit of pleasure or whatever for each dollar they own. Now imagine a thief who steals a substantial amount of money, let's say $10,000 from Smith. So according to this thought experiment, Smith is now in a deficit of 10,000 units of pleasure from what he was previous to having the thief steal this money. But let's imagine that this thief, rather than keeping it to themselves, gives it to Jones rather than keeping it. In fact, you could simplify the experiment and just have Jones be the thief, but to keep it cleaner, let's imagine that there's a third party who's doing the redistribution of wealth in this way. So Jones is given Smith's $10,000. So now Jones is $10,000. He doesn't know that it was stolen, let's suppose. So he just receives this. He thinks he's won the sweepstakes or something. So he wins this and he gets, or so he thinks, and so he gets $10,000 more, and so he has that much more pleasure. Now, utilitarianism tells us that this thief has done nothing wrong. It's true that Smith is 10,000 units of pleasure less happy, but Jones is 10,000 units more happy. So the net situation is the same. It's a wash. In terms of the amount of pleasure, whatever the amount of pleasure was across Smith and Jones before, it's the same now. It's just that it's been redistributed. So this person has done something morally neutral according to utilitarianism. But of course, our moral intuitions tell us that they certainly have not done something morally neutral. They have wronged Smith and have unjustly benefited Jones, and they should return the money and probably be punished for what they did. So that's a second example. It does make a difference if you're harming someone versus just benefiting someone. The second area, distributive justice, is another problem. Utilitarianism is concerned only with the amount of happiness in society, not the distribution of happiness. Hence, utilitarianism is committed to saying that 2 outcomes like this are equivalent. So let's say we have option A and option B. So option A and option B represent 2 actions that one may take. And let's say that if I take option A, I'm going to be distributing pleasure across society in this way. So this represents, let's say there are 4 individuals in society and I'm distributing pleasure in this way. So what I'm doing is I'm taking 2 units away from one person and let's say adding 2 to these 3 people. That's if I do option A. So this person is going to be in a negative route. I'm inflicting pain, in other words, on this person who's got -2. But with these, there's going to be a plus. Maybe I'll add a plus here just so we can see that that's the case. Okay. So there's 3 people who I'm giving 2 units of pleasure to, but at the cost of causing 2 units of pain to a person. And then versus option B, where I'm adding just 1 unit to everyone, but I'm causing pain to no one. So I'm giving everyone +1. Okay, so that's the situation. Maybe so it's clear that I'm not adding these together. I'll go back to this. But just keep in mind this is a -2. And the point is that this, according to utilitarianism, these two options are equivalent because in both cases I'm adding 4 units of pleasure to society, right? Here I'm just adding 4 to 4 different people. Here I'm adding 2 each to 3 people for a total of 6 units of pleasure, but I need to subtract 2 because I'm causing 2 units of pain, so it ends up being a net 4. So these are both 4. And so utilitarianism says, well, they're both 4, so who cares what you do? They're both equally good. But intuitively, of course, we would tend to say that actually, no, option B is better because B is fairer, it's a more just distribution. Option A, this poor person is getting caused to have 2 units of pain just for the sake of benefiting these other 3, we would say. And so this seems less good overall, even though, of course, in the net amount of pleasure that's being added, it is equivalent to this one. But this one is better because it's a fair distribution. So that's just to say that utilitarianism doesn't seem to have a way of making those distinctions, which are often described as distinctions of justice. Also, note a common theme in these problematic scenarios that I went through, the organ transplant case, the case of Smith and Jones, and the case of the distributions in option A and option B. In all these scenarios, they seem to involve the violation of the rights of people. A violation of the rights of people. This suggests that utilitarianism allows or even requires the disregarding of the concept of a right. And that obviously seems morally unacceptable to us, given the importance of the notion of a right to our moral worldview. Now, none of this is to say that these problems are insuperable in some way. There are going to be ways to deal with this that utilitarians are going to propose. Of course, utilitarians are going to have things to say about this. The point is merely that this is one of the factors that's going to complicate the theory, and that it stands in the background, not necessarily these cases, but cases along these lines or similar cases. It stands in the background of Mill's Chapter 5. One common move is worth saying at the outset, because you can see hints of this in Chapter 5 of Utilitarianism as well as elsewhere in the book, is to switch from act utilitarianism to rule utilitarianism. So this distinction, once again, is a common one in the literature, although it's not terminology that Mill uses. It's become commonplace and well known. The distinction between act utilitarianism versus rule utilitarianism. And I mentioned this in a previous video, but just once again, act utilitarianism is quite simply utilitarianism applied to individual action. So every individual action that you perform is to be evaluated according to the greatest happiness principle, and you are to choose that action that will produce the greatest net happiness overall. Maximize utility in each and every one of your actions. Now, remember that previously Mill had countered the objection that this seems to make utilitarianism too impractical and it's too unwieldy because with every action you have to do this complex calculation and so forth. And so that actually gave some credence to the view that perhaps Mill is a rule utilitarian. And his language of saying that actions are right as they tend to produce the greatest happiness and wrong as they tend to produce unhappiness suggested that, in fact, what he's concerned with are not individual actions, but rather the rules that prescribe to us those actions that, on the whole, tend to produce one type of outcome. And so rule utilitarianism would be the view that the greatest happiness principle is not applied directly to individual acts, but rather it's applied only to rules. And so there are these secondary precepts, as Aquinas might have called them, that we follow, and we select among those precepts those that have, through the course of human experience, tended to promote happiness, according to the way people have discovered these things to go. So the rules should be selected based upon overall utility, and you can see how opting for a kind of rule utilitarian solution could perhaps seem promising in dealing with some of these issues. So take the hospital case. One could argue that no, there should be even though the act of harvesting the organs of this person seems like it would be the thing that produces the most utility in this particular scenario, we can see that if that became allowed as a rule, it would produce a great net harm and less utility than if we had a rule that said, if you go into the hospital, they can't harvest your organs. Because without such a rule, people, of course, would come to expect that they would be at great risk if they went to the hospital for a checkup. If there were enough people there at the time who needed organ transplants, or even if there weren't, they might be knocked out and killed for their organs. And so they wouldn't go to check. They wouldn't go to get treatments and non-life-threatening treatments and things like this. And so not only under this scenario would there not be people available for organ transplants in this way, but of course people would become sicker overall in society because people would be avoiding the hospital. And so the greater happiness would be served by having a rule that prohibited that. So that would be the idea. Or you could also argue that society would be more harmonious if we have a just distribution. So without the resentments that would result in that -2 group from option A in the two options example that I considered. The people who are going to have to have pain inflicted upon them so that the other three, we can imagine them as classes of society now rather than individuals. So imagine that we have those 4 classes of society, and the 3 are given +2, but at the cost of the one class being given -2. And we could imagine, well, this would foster resentments in society. This could cause social strife. And so it would be better if we have a just distribution. And so we justify rules of distributive justice on the basis of their utility. Okay. Well, we see in Chapter 5 that Mill does seem to be following something like a rule utilitarian scheme along those lines. Chapter 5 begins with Mill's acknowledgement that justice seems to be the Achilles heel of utilitarianism. He says, right in the opening paragraph, in all ages of speculation, one of the strongest obstacles to the reception of the doctrine of that utility or happiness is the criterion of right and wrong, has been drawn from the idea of justice. The powerful sentiment and apparently clear perception, which the word recalls with a rapidity and certainty resembling an instinct, have seemed to the majority of thinkers to point to an inherent quality in things, to show that the just must have an existence in nature as something absolute, generically distinct from every variety of the expedient, and an idea opposed to it, though, as is commonly acknowledged, never in the long run disjoined from it in fact. You can glean from this what Mill sees as the errors in the traditional view of justice. And this is, above all, what he's concerned to combat in this chapter, the idea that justice is an inherent quality in things, that it has an existence in nature by itself as something absolute, different from everything that's merely expedient. And he uses the word expedient, of course, here to refer to what is going to tend to produce the greatest happiness. So, the idea that there is this kind of moral standard of justice that's written into the nature of things and that has absolute demands stands as a potential obstacle to the idea that utilitarianism contains the greatest principle, or the greatest happiness principle is the supreme principle of morality that governs all of our moral choices. Mill's aim in this chapter will be to reduce justice to utility and thus eliminate the apparent conflict between them. For Mill, justice is only a particular kind or branch of general utility. And that's a direct quote from chapter 2. Justice, quote, is only a particular kind or branch of general utility. So justice is not some separate standard that stands over against the utilitarian standard and that can oppose it, can undermine it. Rather, justice itself is ultimately derived from the standard of utility. Now, Mill admits that the feeling of justice seems to be innate, a peculiar instinct, as he puts it. But he claims that this means nothing as far as its binding force goes. It still might need to be enlightened. The mere fact that we have an instinct, even one that might have some moral import, doesn't necessarily mean that it's binding in itself. People become aware of the natural feelings of justice and then infer from this that justice is what he calls an ultimate criterion of conduct. But Mill is going to question this. This, he thinks, is a psychological illusion to which mankind is prone, to believe that a subjective feeling, not otherwise accounted for, is an objective reality. But does the reality to which the feeling of justice corresponds need such a special revelation, i.e., to posit some transcendent, non-natural reality? Mill answers this on the top of 43. Sorry, that's in this text, 43, but this is paragraph 2. The purpose of this inquiry is practically important to consider whether the feeling itself of justice and injustice is sui generis like our sensations of color and taste, or a derivative feeling formed by the combination of others. So this term sui generis, meaning it generated from itself, self-generated, meaning it's not reducible to anything more basic, like the sensations of color and taste. These are just things we perceive, and if you don't perceive them, there's no way to really explain to you what they are. And similarly with justice, that would be the claim that justice is this kind of just this perception that people have that's sort of innate to them, at least people with normal functioning moral senses or something like that. And Mill is going to be asking, well, is this really the case? Is it the case that we have some kind of innate sense of justice that tells us that utilitarian judgments are wrong in some cases and so forth? The question Mill will consider is whether justice is merely a kind or branch or species of general utility, or whether it has a different origin altogether. To elucidate this question, Mill thinks we need to investigate what is the distinguishing character of justice. So in paragraph 3, he says, I guess this is the second sentence, if in everything which men are accustomed to characterize as just or unjust, some one common attribute or collection of attributes is always present, we may judge whether this particular attribute or combination of attributes would be capable of gathering around it a sentiment of that peculiar character and intensity by virtue of the general laws of our emotional constitution, or whether the sentiment is inexplicable and requires to be regarded as a special provision of nature. In other words, can the general character of human psychology explain why we invest so much importance in the things we call just, or do we need some special explanation for this? So the first step is to determine what is the common attribute of all things that we call just or unjust. To do this, to determine what the common attribute is of things we call just or unjust, we need to conduct an empirical survey of these various things that are considered just or unjust. Mill discusses 6 areas where the terms justice and injustice are commonly applied. So keep track of the areas where terms just or unjust, or of course various cognate forms of this, are applied. First, in paragraph 5, he says, it is just to respect and unjust to violate the legal rights of anyone, to deprive anyone of personal liberty or property that belongs to him by law, unless they have forfeited these rights. So that's the first area. The area of legal rights. We often speak of justice or injustice when we're talking about the legal rights of someone. Second, taking or withholding from any person that to which he has a moral right. That's in paragraph 6. So this would apply especially in cases in which people would apply the concept of an unjust law. We have the notion people are treated unjustly, not because their legal rights are violated, but because the law itself is regarded as unjust, as in Jim Crow laws or apartheid laws, things like this. So, of course, this is closely related to the legal rights, but it extends beyond the scope of legal rights. We have the idea of people having moral rights, human rights, we might say, quite apart from what their legal rights might be. Third, there's the idea that each person should get what they deserve. It is just, people tend to think, that good people should receive good things as their reward, and that evil people should receive bad things as their punishment. It's unjust when the evil go unpunished and the good suffer. And Mill notes that this seems to be the clearest and most emphatic form in which the idea of justice is conceived by the general mind. That's in paragraph 7. The clearest and most emphatic form in which the idea of justice is conceived by the general mind is this idea of good people should be rewarded and bad people should be punished. And this involves the notion of desert. Desert. This is desert in the sense that it's spelled like desert, the geographic area, but pronounced like the course that one has after the main meal, the sweet course. Dessert. That is to say, what one deserves. What one deserves. The basic idea is that a person deserves good if he does right, and he deserves evil if he does wrong. Okay. Fourth, it's unjust to break faith with anyone, to violate an agreement, or to disappoint expectations that one has voluntarily raised in someone. This can be overruled by a stronger obligation of justice, or if a person forfeits their right to the benefit which they've been led to expect. But generally speaking, the default condition would be that if you agreed to do something, you should do it, or that's unjust. If you made a promise, you should keep your promise, so that's unjust. You can't typically use as an excuse there was something else you could do that would produce more goodness in the world. So this is the fourth one, unjust to break faith. For example, breaking a promise. Disappointing someone's reasonable expectation when they were counting on you. Fifth, it's often thought to be unjust to show partiality, to show favoritism or preference for one person over another. Yet often it's considered permissible or even obligatory to do so. So, for example, with respect to one's family or friends. But outside of those specially defined cases, it's considered to be unjust to show partiality. And then finally, justice and injustice are applied, of course, in areas where we're discussing equality. In the eyes of many persons, Mill says, equality constitutes the essence of justice. So here we have areas in which the concepts of just and unjust are often applied in the area of legal rights, in the area of moral rights, in the area of desert, when we're talking about someone getting what they deserve. In the sense that it's believed unjust to break faith, and that it's unjust to show partiality, and then also in the area of equality. So this is just a kind of empirical survey that Mill undertakes in order to kind of get at what's the central sense of this idea of justice. What do people have in mind when they're thinking of justice? So we have justice linked to ideas of upholding legal and moral rights, of desert, of keeping or breaking faith, of impartiality, partiality, and equality. And Mill asks, what is it that holds all these diverse associations or senses of justice together? Now, he next proposes that a clue may be found in etymology, and this is in paragraph 12, where he says, in most, if not all languages, the etymology of the word which corresponds to just points distinctly to an origin connected with the ordinances of law. Justum or justum is a form of jussum, I'm not sure how to pronounce that actually, is that which has been ordered. Dikeon comes directly from dike, a suit at law. Rect, from which came right and righteous, is synonymous with law. The courts of law, the administration of justice, are the courts and the administration of law. So there's this tight connection between the idea of justice and the idea of law that is found in the etymology of the various words. Now, etymology is not necessarily a sure guide to what the word means now, and Mill is well aware of this. But it does give a sense of how the word sprang up. So Mill's view then is that the primitive element in the notion of justice was the idea of conformity to law. The primitive element in the idea of justice was conformity to law. Mill observes that the two main roots of Western civilization, Hebrew and Greco-Roman culture, both link justice to the idea of law. The Hebrew law is assumed to be perfect since it comes from God. This is what's called the positive law, that is the empirically available law that is in effect in the actual historical situation. Whereas the Greco-Roman culture assumed law as man-made, but still the standard was the perfect or the ideal law. So they sort of complement each other, he seems to be saying here, that Jews emphasize the positive law, whereas the Greeks emphasize the ideal law. And we see there the correspondence between the idea of, let's say, natural law and human law in Aquinas. Mill thinks that he discerns the idea of legal constraint operating even in our commonplace notions of everyday private life. Even where we would not want to see the civil authorities necessarily butting in, we still, he says, should be glad to see just conduct enforced and injustice repressed. So, someone breaks a promise to you. It's not that you're going to call the cops on them, or you think that would be a good idea if we had every promise that someone made was policed. But still, if the person in breaking their promise to you has something bad happen to them as a result, proportionate to the wrong that they have done you, most people would think that there's a kind of justice in that. Mill notes that so far, this account of the origin and progressive growth of the idea of justice applies not only to justice specifically, but to all morality. The idea of penal sanction enters essentially into the very notion of right and wrong. The notion of moral duty or obligation includes the idea that one may be compelled to do it. Duty is something that may be exacted from a person. Mill compares it to exacting repayment of a debt. Deserving or not deserving punishment is what distinguishes right and wrong from what it's merely prudent to do or laudable to do. Because of this, because that is the ideas of right and wrong themselves seem to include this idea of sanction, Mill still needs to say more to distinguish justice from the other branches of morality. First, Mill notes a traditional distinction that moral philosophers had drawn between two types of duties. So, or duty, by duty we just mean here a moral obligation in this context. So, we have the idea of duty or obligation, something that you morally ought to do, is what we mean by that. And then these are divided traditionally into perfect and imperfect duties. And the basic idea here is this is the sense of perfect and imperfect, where perfect indicates completion. Something is perfected when it is completed in this sense. And in that sense, imperfect means not less good so much as it just means that it's not completed. So these are complete duties that admit of being completed versus these are duties that don't admit of being completed. So imperfect duties we might describe as sort of open-ended, whereas perfect duties are dischargeable. That is to say, if I promise you that I will come over and, help you fix your car, and I come over and help you fix your car, I no longer have any obligations to you. I've discharged my duty, like in the sense that you discharge a library book when you bring it back. But with other types of duties, they're more open-ended. So, for example, most people think that one has a duty to do something for the betterment of one's fellow human beings or one's neighbors. That one, shouldn't be just totally selfish. But how much benevolence and what kind of benevolence and to whom and what occasions, this is left sort of open-ended. And you can never just, as it were, rest on your laurels and say, well, I'm done. I don't have any obligations anymore to help anyone ever again. That's not the way it normally is understood to work. So Mill notes that perfect duties, these duties that are dischargeable, involve a correlative right that resides in some person. The perfect duties correlate to a right. Someone has a right. If you have a perfect duty, then someone has a right that corresponds to that. So in my example, if I promise you I'll help you fix your car, I have a duty to help that person fix their car. So there's the duty. It's a perfect duty in this sense. And then that correlates to the right that the other person has to expect me to, at some point, help them fix their car. And so they have a right to that expectation. They have a right to my actions because of the promise I made. So duties correlate to some right. And Mill suggests that this coincides with the distinction between justice and morality in general. So the idea would be something like this. These perfect duties are duties of justice. They concern the sphere of justice, whereas these concern morality generally. these imperfect open-ended duties. So open-ended duties like benevolence, being helpful, being a helpful person, being generous and not selfish, and so forth, that belongs to morality in general. Whereas particular duties that are correlative to people's rights, that corresponds to justice. Justice implies something which some individual person can claim from us as his moral right. So on this point, Mill believes he's determined the constitutive elements of the idea of justice. And we could write this out. So justice is the idea of giving to certain persons what is due to them as their right. As this is determined by law, and which is subject to sanction. If the right is violated. This is the idea of justice according to Mill. Justice is the idea of giving to certain persons what is due to them as their right, as this is determined by law, and which is subject to sanction if the law or right is violated. And this leads to the first discussion question. Do you agree with Mill's account of the origin of the idea of justice and the elements of this idea? Would you define justice as Mill does, or do you see justice differently? Explain your answer. So once again, the first discussion question. Do you agree with Mill's account of the origin of the idea of justice and the elements of this idea? Would you define justice as Mill does, or do you see justice differently? Explain your answer. Next, we're up to paragraph 16. Mill turns to the question of whether the feeling, I'm quoting now from paragraph 16, whether the feeling which accompanies the idea of justice is attached to it by a special dispensation of nature, or whether it could have grown up by any known laws out of the idea itself, and in particular whether it can have originated in considerations of general expediency. In other words, does this feeling that those who violate the law or the rights of others ought to be punished or sanctions arise from some original source in our nature that's independent of the consideration of what promotes general happiness? Or did it arise merely from considerations of what promotes general happiness? In other words, did this idea of justice and the feeling that, justice is an important thing to maintain, did this arise from some original source separate from the desire for happiness, or does it arise from the desire for happiness itself? And Mill's answer, as already said, is that the sentiment itself of justice may not arise from an idea of expediency, but he says whatever is moral in it does. So what he has in mind here is that there are two ingredients in the sentiment of justice. We're talking here now about that feeling, that passion, the passion that sends people out in the streets demanding justice, right? That's the sentiment of justice. And he says there are two elements here. The first is a desire to punish the person who has done harm. And the second is the idea that there is some definite individual or individuals to whom harm has been done. Now, the first ingredient, a desire to punish the person who's done harm, Mill traces to two natural sentiments or instincts. So this, he says, comes from the impulse to self-defense, and two, from sympathy. The desire to punish someone who's done wrong comes from the two natural instincts of the impulse of self-defense and the feeling of sympathy. Now, the feeling of sympathy can, in human beings, extend widely, such that, as he says in paragraph 20, by virtue of his superior intelligence, even apart from his spiritual range of sympathy, a human being is capable of apprehending a community of interest between himself and human society, the human society of which he forms a part, such that any conduct which threatens the security of the society generally is threatening to his own, and calls forth his instinct of self-defense. Thus, according to Mill, the element in the sentiment of justice that consists in the desire to punish is the natural feeling of retaliation or vengeance, he says. Paragraph 21, he says, quote, the natural feeling of retaliation or vengeance rendered by intellect and sympathy applicable to those injuries, that is, to those hurts which wound us through or in common with society at large. So the idea here is that this ingredient in justice, the desire to see the person punished, it's basically rooted in the natural reaction that we would have is if we were harmed, we would want to retaliate in the same way that if you harm an animal, the animal is going to retaliate as a form of self-defense. So it's that natural instinct. But then through our intellect and our sympathy, through the second natural feeling, our feeling of sympathy, which in human beings is larger than in any other animal, because it's combined with the intellect and we can conceive of being sympathetic with society at large. Through that expansion of the scope of our feelings of common cause, we can come to want to seek punishment to anyone who harms society at large in any way. And so we desire to see the criminal punished, even though maybe the criminal didn't do anything directly to us. We sympathize with society at large, and we sympathize, of course, with the particular victims, but we also sympathize with the way in which the criminal harms society at large. And in this way, we desire to have them punished. But Mill comments that the mere desire for revenge has nothing moral in it. So merely the desire to see the criminal punished, he seems to be saying, has no desire or has no moral content in it. It's only gets its moral character when it's directed towards serving the common good. Directed towards serving the common good. So examples of this are resenting a hurt to society, although it's not otherwise a hurt to oneself, and not resenting a hurt to oneself unless it's of a kind that society also has an interest in repressing. In other words, it has moral content if you admit that you deserve to be punished or sanctioned, even though it's something harmful to yourself, because society has an interest in punishing people who did the thing you did. In sum, Mill analyzes justice into two main parts. There's a rule of conduct and a sentiment that sanctions the rule. So there's the rule that promotes the general happiness, And the sentiment is the desire that people who violate the rules should be punished. And this is just an expansion of the animal desire to retaliate, combined with sympathy and generalized to all persons. In addition, Mill says that the rules of justice involve a conception of some definite person whose rights would be violated by an injustice. To say that a person has a right is merely to say that he has a valid claim on society to protect him in the possession of it. Mill clarifies that in paragraph 24. In 25, he explains how, according to him, rights are ultimately based on considerations of utility. Rights are ultimately based on considerations of utility. So, paragraph 25, to have a right, then, is, I conceive, to have something which society ought to defend me in the possession of. To have a right is, I conceive, to have something which society ought to defend me in the possession of. If the objector goes on to ask why it ought, I can give him no other reason than the general utility. If that expression does not seem to convey a sufficient feeling of the strength of the obligation, nor to account for the peculiar energy of the feeling, it is because there goes to the composition of the sentiment not a rational only, but also an animal element, the thirst for retaliation, and this thirst derives its intensity as well as its moral justification from the extraordinarily important and impressive kind of utility which is concerned. Mill goes on to explain that the idea of a right is based on the interest that every animal has, let alone human beings, the interest that every animal has in security, which explains the visceral passion that a person has when it concerns questions of rights. Because we have such a great interest in maintaining the security of our body and possessions, and because we depend upon the rules of society to assist us in maintaining these, the feeling that surrounds the idea of our rights gets inflated to an absolute status. This creates the illusion that the questions of rights and justice have an inherent validity in themselves, but for Mill, they're really just rooted in the utility of security. Now, Mill is aware that his opponents have proposed, or the opponents of utilitarianism in general, that these have proposed that the criterion of utility must be regulated and held in check by the criterion of justice. Further, that this is a possibility only if there's some independent source and basis for the idea of justice, that is, a source independent from utility. Only if justice is rooted in somewhere else than in utility can justice be a check on utility. So they appeal to the idea that justice is innate, that it's an innate idea available to every mind, accessible by mere introspection. Mill is also aware that his opponents have often claimed that the dictates of justice are clearer and more certain than those of utility. However, Mill challenges these claims. In the area of just punishment, to be sure, there's much disagreement, and hence presumably unclarity, regarding what justice demands or allows. For example, if punishment is primarily for the good of the punished or for society, that is, there's disagreement over whether punishment should be for the good of the punished or for the good of society, whether it's retribution that looks backwards to payback, or whether it's corrective and forward-looking, as in the Department of Corrections, not the Department of Payback that houses prisoners. Now, Mill notes that the differences in the penal systems of various countries suggest that there's a lot of relativity and variability in ideas of justice, depending upon where you were born and raised. There's similar disagreement over issues of distributive justice. For example, should a person be paid based upon the market value of his work or on the basis of his efforts? Is it effort, blood, sweat, and tears that should count the most? Or should society reward the more efficient laborer? Another question where justice seems to be unclear: what's a just form of taxation? Should everyone pay the same tax, or should they be taxed the same percentage of their income? Should there be a graduated tax rate? A case can be made for justice and injustice in all three cases. By the way, I post this video on April 14th, so those of you watching in the United States who haven't filed your taxes yet, you're welcome for the reminder. But anyway, Mill's point is that in cases such as these, where we're talking about the penal system, whether we're talking about just wage or just income distribution, whether we're talking about just taxation, it's not justice that guides and controls utility, but rather it's the reverse. It's utility that guides and controls justice. So in the 30th paragraph, at the end, he says, "Who shall decide between these appeals to conflicting principles of justice? Justice has in this case two sides to it, which it is impossible to bring into harmony, and the two disputants have chosen opposite sides. The one looks to what is just that the individual should receive, the other to what is just that the community should give. Each from his own point of view is unanswerable." That is, it's possible to have warring conceptions of justice that are incommensurable, that are unreconcilable from within the point of view of each. There's no overall conception of justice that can help us to adjudicate between the warring demands of the community on the one side or the individual on the other in these cases. Each from his own point of view is unanswerable, and any choice between them on grounds of justice must be perfectly arbitrary. Social utility alone can decide the preference. So the point is that how do we settle these matters? Well, we say what's going to produce the greatest happiness overall. So we opt in many Western countries for a graduated income tax rate because we think, not because there's not considerations to be argued for on the side of everyone paying a flat tax or whatever, or paying the same even. You might think it's just that everyone should make the same contribution to society. And there are certainly arguments that people understand that can be made for that. But we have a graduated income tax rate for considerations of utility. This is going to produce the greatest happiness overall. Thus, according to Mill, justice is grounded in utility. Justice is grounded in utility. Because the rules of justice are established and maintained due to their social utility. Now, various aspects of this utility can be described. I'll just go through these quickly. I will write these down. But some of the aspects that Mill considers, or that he mentions, that explain how utility can establish rules of justice. What is the utility of justice? Well, rules of justice promote human well-being by protecting people from harming each other. They promote human well-being by protecting people from harming each other. They deter a wrongful interference in one another's freedom. They enable human affairs to be managed and regulated, like in business or financial affairs. They enable human affairs to be managed and regulated. Rules of justice. Rules of justice preserve peace among human beings. And they promote social feeling among humankind. People can proceed with trust in one another rather than being constantly on guard against one another. In sum, the good consequences. It is the good consequences. It's the good consequences that come from the observance of rules of justice in society and the great harm that results from the violation of these rules that explains the powerful motives that human beings have always had for instituting such rules. So justice, for Mill, it seems, is founded on a form of rule utilitarianism. We select certain rules on the basis of the social utility they will provide, and these are the rules of justice. Okay, this leads to the second discussion question. Do you agree with Mill that justice is ultimately founded upon considerations of social expediency or utility? What are some of the problems, if any, with this view? What alternative foundation might justice have? Once again, second discussion question. Do you agree with Mill that justice is ultimately founded upon considerations of social expediency or utility? What are some of the problems, if any, with this view? What alternative foundation might justice have?